It started with a fence, a simple, ugly wooden fence that appeared overnight, where the morning before there had only been grass. To anyone else it might have looked harmless, even ordinary. But to me it was a scar, a jagged wound cut straight across my property line. I remember standing there, barefoot in the dewy grass, staring at those crooked planks like they were a declaration of war. And in a way, they were. What began as a small boundary dispute soon became something much darker, something that turned quiet suburban mornings into a slow, burning nightmare. Because that fence wasn't just misplaced, it was planned, built an inch at a time over my land, sanctioned by a group of people who hid behind HOA bylaws and fake smiles. People who waved at me during morning walks, all while plotting how to strip away what I owned piece by piece. They called it a community improvement project. I called it theft. But in neighborhoods like ours, truth doesn't matter when the board decides who's right. The HOA, a handful of neighbors with too much time and too little conscience, made sure of that. Fines appeared in my mailbox like clockwork, letters filled with threats written in the language of authority. They told me to stay quiet, to comply, to be a good neighbor. But they didn't know what happens when you push a man past his breaking point. I wasn't just fighting for my property anymore. I was fighting for my dignity, my peace, my right to exist without permission. And when they built that fence, something inside me hardened, the same way concrete does when it sets for the last time. By the time the final confrontation came, there was no going back. Their gate stood proudly on my stolen land, a symbol of arrogance and control. But they didn't realize I was about to bury it, not just in concrete, but in truth. Because sometimes when people build walls to trap you, you make sure those walls become their prison instead. So tell me, what would you do if your neighbors tried to fence you out of your own life? Would you move quietly? Or make sure they never forget the day they crossed the line? In the quiet heart of Willow Creek Estates, a suburban neighborhood just far enough from the city to promise peace, but close enough to taste its pulse, life seemed almost too perfect. The streets were lined with symmetrical trees that swayed in harmony, the lawns were trimmed like green velvet carpets, and every driveway gleamed with polished ambition. It was the kind of place where the scent of fresh-cut grass mixed with the faint aroma of morning coffee, and neighbors waved at each other with choreographed smiles that hid tiny fractures beneath the surface. From a distance, Willow Creek was the picture of harmony, a place where people came to build lives, raise families, and chase a quieter kind of happiness. But as with most beautifully painted pictures, if you looked long enough, you could see the cracks beneath the colors. Laura Bennett had lived there for nearly 7 years. Her home sat on the corner of Maple Crescent, a modest 2-story with white shutters and a garden she tended with pride. To her, that small patch of land meant more than property. It was her sanctuary, her escape from a past that had taken more than it gave. Every morning she would sip her coffee by the kitchen window and watch the sunrise touch her roses with gold. It was peace, hard-earned and cherished. She believed she had finally found a place where she could breathe without fear. But peace in Willow Creek was conditional, fragile, and often dependent on the invisible approval of those who believed they owned the rules of paradise. The HOA board was the unspoken monarchy of this little kingdom. Karen Holloway, the president, carried herself with the kind of confidence that could command a room, but chilled those who knew her better. Her smile was polished, her tone always pleasant, but behind those honeyed words lived control, precise and relentless. She was joined by Mark Dawson, the treasurer, whose watchful eyes saw everything and judged even more. Then there was Carol, the secretary, who lived for whispers, a collector of gossip who always seemed to know things before they were said. Together they ran the HOA with the precision of a courtroom and the pride of a small empire. They called it preserving the community's values. Others quietly called it power wrapped in politeness. Laura had managed to stay out of their radar for years. She paid her dues on time, followed the rules, and avoided neighborhood politics. But sometimes all it takes is one harmless decision to stir the calm. For Laura, it began with her garden, a small addition she thought would make her home feel even more like her own. It was nothing extravagant, just a wooden archway with ivy crawling across it and a new set of solar lights lining the walkway. She wanted it to feel warm, welcoming, a touch of soul in a place obsessed with uniformity. But in the eyes of the HOA, individuality was often mistaken for defiance. The first letter came on a Tuesday. It was folded neatly, printed in bold letters, and slipped into her mailbox like a quiet accusation. Violation, unauthorized structural modification. Laura frowned as she read it, confusion turning slowly into disbelief. She walked outside, scanning her garden, wondering how something so simple could offend. The words felt heavy, almost absurd, but when she looked around the neighborhood, she caught the faint twitch of curtains, the subtle awareness that eyes were watching. She didn't know it then, but that letter wasn't just a warning. It was the first move in a game she never agreed to play. As days passed, small shifts began to ripple through her once peaceful life. Karen's once cordial greetings turned into distant nods. Conversations that used to flow with casual warmth now carried a faint chill. She noticed how neighbors began avoiding eye contact, how whispers followed her walks to the mailbox. Each evening, as she stood in her garden, she felt a strange unease settle over her, like a shadow that didn't belong. The community that once felt welcoming now pulsed with silent judgment. At the next HOA meeting, she decided to attend, just to understand, she told herself. The room was filled with the quiet hum of suburban civility, a tension wrapped in smiles. Karen presided at the center, her clipboard an extension of her authority. "We appreciate your presence, Laura," she said sweetly, "but rules are rules. Everyone must adhere to the same standards." Her tone was coated with diplomacy, but Laura could hear the undertone. This wasn't about rules. It was about control. When Laura tried to explain that her archway wasn't structural, that it was decorative, Karen's lips curved into that familiar smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "We'll review it," she said, already moving on to the next item, dismissing Laura with the grace of someone closing a door. That night, Laura couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying every word, every glance, every polite threat hidden behind community etiquette. It was just a garden feature, she told herself. But beneath that reasoning, something deeper stirred, the sense that she had touched a nerve, that something much larger was at play. Soon, the letters multiplied. One for her paint color being slightly off the approved palette, another for inconsistent trash can placement. Each one came with fines, deadlines, and a tone that grew more intimidating. Neighbors who once waved now looked away. She overheard murmurs that Laura was becoming difficult, uncooperative, even a problem. It baffled her how quickly perception could shift, how reputation could unravel in the hands of a few determined voices. Karen, of course, appeared unbothered. To her it was simply the order of things being maintained. But in private she saw Laura as a challenge, a reminder that her power wasn't absolute unless everyone bowed to it. And Mark, ever the loyal enforcer, made sure no rule was left unchecked when it came to Laura's property. Each week he drove by slowly, noting every imperfection, documenting each imagined offense. For Laura, what began as irritation slowly turned into something heavier, isolation. The place that once felt like home now echoed with quiet hostility. Even her morning coffee by the window felt different. The sunlight still touched her roses, but it no longer felt warm. She caught herself wondering if moving away would be easier. But then she'd look at her garden, the one she built with her own hands, and something inside her refused to yield. This was her home. She had followed the rules. Why should she be the one to leave? Then, one evening, as she watered her plants, she noticed a small envelope tucked under her doormat. No HOA letterhead this time, just her name written in elegant cursive. Inside was a single note. Some things are better left as they are. Don't make this harder. No signature, no explanation. Just a warning that made her chest tighten. That was the moment Laura realized. This wasn't just about her garden anymore. It was personal. And as much as the HOA believed they were in control, they had no idea what they had just awakened. Because when someone who's already lost everything finally decides to fight back, peace will no longer be their priority. And in Willow Creek, where every lawn is perfect and every smile rehearsed, the real war was only just beginning. By late summer, the air in Willow Creek estates had changed. It no longer smelled of freshly cut grass and warm evening barbecues. It smelled of suspicion, tension, and something sour hiding beneath the surface. The once idyllic neighborhood now felt like a living thing, pulsing with quiet hostility, whispering behind trimmed hedges and polished mailboxes. For Laura Bennett, every step outside her door became an exercise in vigilance. Her home, once a sanctuary, had turned into a stage. Every movement observed, every choice questioned, every smile weighed for hidden meaning. It began subtly at first, a new letter in the mailbox, this time accusing her of unauthorized lighting installation. The solar lamps she had installed months ago, harmless, decorative, were now allegedly violating illumination uniformity standards. Laura read the line twice, disbelieving it even as she felt the chill of realization settle in her chest. She tried to reason with herself. Surely this was some misunderstanding. But the next day, another letter arrived. This one warned of accumulating fines if the issue wasn't resolved immediately. She replaced the lights with standard white bulbs, exactly as specified. But 3 days later, another complaint arrived. Non-compliant color temperature. The absurdity might have been funny if it hadn't felt so targeted. It was clear by now that the HOA wasn't maintaining standards, they were maintaining power. Mark Dawson, the treasurer, began making his rounds more frequently. His silver SUV would crawl down Maple Crescent at odd hours, pausing in front of Laura's house long enough for her to notice, but never long enough to confront. He would jot something down in his little notebook, then drive off slowly, like a predator reminding its prey that it's still being watched. Once Laura caught him taking photos of her mailbox. Another time she saw him crouched by her fence, measuring tape in hand. When she stepped outside to ask what he was doing, he gave her that dry, bureaucratic smile. "Routine inspection," he said simply, as though it explained everything. At first, she tried to play by their rules, responding politely, documenting every interaction, sending written appeals. But the responses were always the same. The board has reviewed your request and determined that corrective action is still required. The fines kept adding up. $50, then $100, then $200. Each envelope carried not just numbers, but a threat. It was no longer about garden arches or lighting. It was about submission. The neighbors, once friendly, now acted like strangers. Mrs. Patterson from across the street stopped waving during her morning walks. The kids who used to play near Laura's front yard now crossed to the other side of the street, their parents calling after them in lowered voices. It wasn't long before rumors began to ripple through the cul-de-sac. "She's suing the HOA," someone said. "She's behind on dues," whispered another. Each lie spread like wildfire through the carefully curated gossip channels of suburban life, book clubs, morning jogs, and Facebook groups. But the most hurtful moment came one afternoon when Laura overheard two women outside the grocery store, women she once considered friends. "You know," one said softly, "it's always the quiet ones who cause trouble. Karen's just trying to keep the community in order." The other nodded, clutching her shopping cart like a shield. "I heard Laura's been aggressive. Maybe she's not as nice as she seems." That night, Laura sat at her kitchen table surrounded by letters, each one a different kind of accusation. She felt anger boiling beneath her exhaustion, a deep, trembling rage that made her hands shake. But beneath that anger was fear, the kind that seeps into your bones and whispers that you're alone, because that's exactly what the HOA wanted her to believe. Then came the landscaping violation. It was a Saturday morning when Laura found Karen and Mark standing by her property line, clipboards in hand. "We've received multiple complaints," Karen began, her tone syrupy as ever. "Your shrubs extend approximately 12 inches past the approved boundary. It's not a major issue yet, but it needs immediate attention." Laura stared at them, incredulous. "You're measuring my shrubs?" Karen smiled faintly. "Oh, we measure everyone's. Consistency is key to community beauty." For a moment, Laura just stood there, the absurdity of it all colliding with the sheer pettiness. "You can't be serious," but they were. By evening, she received an official citation, complete with photographic evidence. That same week, she began noticing small things around her property. A patch of dead grass near the mailbox that hadn't been there before. A missing solar light. A cracked garden gnome that she was sure had been fine the day before. It was subtle, but it felt deliberate, as if someone was reminding her that her home wasn't as safe as it once was. Then came the email from the HOA, an invitation to a mandatory compliance hearing. The tone was formal but unmistakably threatening. Failure to attend, it read, may result in further disciplinary action, including potential legal escalation. The hearing was held in the community center, the same room where neighborhood picnics and bake sales once took place. But now the space felt sterile, almost judicial. Karen sat at the center of the long table, flanked by Mark and Carol, the secretary. They smiled as Laura entered, but the warmth was performative. "Oh, we appreciate your cooperation," Karen began. "Our goal is simply to resolve ongoing issues." Laura took her seat, her heart pounding. "I've followed every instruction you've given me. I've replaced the lights, trimmed the shrubs, repainted the archway. What else do you want?" Mark adjusted his glasses, flipping through his binder. "We've noted several ongoing inconsistencies," he said coolly. "For example, the mulch color in your garden is not within the HOA's approved earth tone range." Laura blinked. "Mulch color?" Karen nodded sympathetically. "It's listed in the bylaws, Section 12C. You received a copy when you moved in." "No one reads 100 pages of bylaws," Laura muttered, her voice trembling with disbelief. "Nevertheless," Karen replied smoothly, "they are binding. You agreed when you signed the covenant." The word covenant hung in the air like a curse. When Laura left that meeting, her hands were shaking. She could feel eyes on her as she walked to her car, neighbors pretending not to watch, but watching all the same. That night she lay awake listening to every creak and rustle outside, her mind spinning through possibilities. Was she paranoid, or was someone actually trying to break her down piece by piece? Days turned into weeks, and the harassment continued, each letter more absurd than the last. A fine for excessive bird activity because her bird feeder attracted too many sparrows. A complaint about her improper recycling placement. Then one morning she woke to find a bright orange notice pinned to her door. Final warning. Before legal action. The sight made her knees buckle. Laura reached out to a local attorney, hoping for guidance. But even he looked uncertain after reviewing the case. "They're technically within their rights," he said carefully. "HOAs have wide latitude under covenant law. Fighting this could be expensive." "Expensive?" she repeated, voice breaking. "They're trying to destroy me," he sighed. "Then you'll have to decide if it's worth the cost." That night Laura sat in the dark, staring at the stack of letters. Somewhere deep down, the fear began to turn into something sharper. Determination. She began documenting everything, every interaction, every photograph, every petty accusation. She started reaching out anonymously to other residents, curious if she was the only one. Slowly, replies trickled in, quiet messages, fearful but supportive. "They did the same thing to me. Karen's been after us for years. I thought I was crazy. It wasn't just her." There were others, silenced, cornered, broken. That realization lit something inside Laura that she hadn't felt in months, defiance. But the more she resisted, the harder they pushed. Late one night, she heard footsteps on her porch. When she opened the door, no one was there, only another envelope, this one unsigned. Inside was a single printed photo. Her garden, taken from an angle that suggested someone had been standing right outside her window, her breath caught in her throat. That was the moment she knew this wasn't just harassment. It was intimidation. The next day she confronted Karen outside the community center. "Stay away from my home," she said, voice trembling but strong. Karen's smile never faltered. "Laura, you're overreacting. If you simply comply, all this will stop. I am complying." Karen tilted her head. "Then perhaps it's not about the rules anymore. Maybe it's about attitude." Those words stayed with Laura long after Karen walked away. It was never about mulch or lights or shrubs. It was about control, about reminding everyone who held the power. Soon after, the HOA announced a special assessment fee for community beautification, a veiled way of passing the cost of their vendetta to every homeowner. The board blamed Laura's non-compliance cases for the need to increase enforcement costs. Her neighbors were furious, not at the HOA, but at her. They started leaving notes on her door. "You're ruining it for everyone. Just move. We don't need your drama here." The pressure was suffocating. Laura felt trapped between defiance and despair. Some nights she dreamed of packing up and leaving everything behind. Other nights she saw Karen's smirk in her mind and knew she couldn't. Then came the turning point, the moment everything shifted. One morning Laura woke to find her garden destroyed. The archway ripped down, flowers uprooted, lights shattered. Her sanctuary, her pride, reduced to ruin. She fell to her knees in the dirt, shaking, tears blurring her vision. It was the final blow. And yet, as she sat there surrounded by chaos, a strange calm washed over her. They wanted her broken. They wanted her silent. But they had just made their biggest mistake. That afternoon, she made a decision that would change everything. She began gathering evidence, not just her own, but from everyone who had ever suffered under the HOA's rule. Secretly, quietly, she built a file of testimonies, photos, recordings. The more she uncovered, the darker it became. Misused funds, personal vendettas, selective enforcement. It wasn't about community preservation. It was a system built on fear and manipulation. As autumn crept into Willow Creek, the leaves turning gold and the air sharpening with cold, Laura's silence became her weapon. She smiled politely at Karen during passing encounters, nodded at Mark's slow drives, and played the role of the defeated homeowner. But behind closed doors, she was planning something that would expose everything. And as the days shortened and tension thickened, the neighborhood didn't yet realize the woman they tried to crush was no longer afraid. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The morning of the hearing began in a fog so heavy that the world looked like it was holding its breath. Every tree, every mailbox, every car parked along Willow Creek Lane felt suspended, waiting for what was coming. Laura stood by her window, staring at the community center at the end of the street, her reflection ghosted against the glass. Today was the day. Months of harassment, intimidation, and humiliation had led to this single moment. The HOA had summoned her for the ultimate disciplinary action, an emergency hearing to vote on foreclosure of her home over unresolved violations and delinquent dues. It was a phrase that sounded almost polite, disguising the cruelty underneath. She had barely slept. Her kitchen table was covered with binders, photographs, letters, and printouts. Every page represented another wound, another attempt to push her past breaking. But this time, she wasn't walking in unprepared. This time, she had her own ammunition. The truth, as she dressed, Laura felt a strange stillness replace her fear. It wasn't confidence exactly, but clarity, a quiet, focused rage that made every movement deliberate. She thought of every moment they had tried to break her, the night she found that anonymous photo on her porch, the fines that kept piling higher, the whispers that painted her as a villain in her own neighborhood. They had taken her peace, but in doing so, they had handed her purpose. When she arrived, the parking lot was already full. People stood in small clusters, whispering. Some avoided her eyes, others stared openly. Curiosity mingled with unease. The HOA board members were already inside, sitting behind a long, folding table as though it were a courtroom bench. Karen, perfectly composed, wore her signature cream blazer, the color of self-righteousness. Mark sat to her right, shuffling papers with calculated indifference. Carol tapped away at her laptop, ready to record every word. "Mrs. Bennett," Karen greeted, her smile stretched thin. "We appreciate your attendance. Let's proceed quickly so we can resolve this matter." Laura took her seat. Her heart pounded, but her voice was steady. "I agree. Let's resolve it once and for all." Karen nodded to Mark. "Please summarize the board's findings." Mark cleared his throat, his tone mechanical. "Over the past 9 months, Mrs. Bennett has accumulated multiple unresolved violations: lighting discrepancies, landscaping overgrowth, decorative noncompliance, and failure to remit fines. Despite repeated warnings and opportunities to correct, these remain outstanding. Under HOA Bylaw Section 18E, the board has the right to initiate foreclosure proceedings to recover unpaid dues and fees totaling $22,000, Karen finished for him, her voice sharp as glass. "A regrettable but necessary action," the room murmured. 22,000. It was an outrageous number, inflated by compounding fines, processing fees, and interest. It was designed to sound legal, to sound justified. Laura leaned forward. "Before we continue, I'd like to ask that this meeting be recorded and entered as part of the official record." Karen blinked, momentarily thrown off. "That's not standard procedure." "Then it should be," Laura said, setting a small recorder on the table. "For transparency." Karen hesitated, then forced a tight smile. "Of course. We have nothing to hide." Laura took a deep breath. "Good, because neither do I." She opened her binder and slid a stack of papers across the table. Certified documents, email transcripts, photos, and reports. "These," she said, "are records from the State Property Commission, the County Tax Office, and communications between multiple homeowners and this board. They show a pattern of selective enforcement, financial mismanagement, and personal targeting. You've used HOA authority not to maintain the community, but to bully residents into submission." Mark frowned. "That's a serious accusation." "It's not an accusation," she said coldly. "It's evidence." The room buzzed again. Karen shifted, her poise beginning to crack. "Mrs. Bennett, this is irrelevant to your violations. You're attempting to deflect." Laura cut her off. "I'm addressing the root cause. You've fined me for solar lights, mulch color, even birds in my yard. But these so-called rules only apply when you decide they should. Funny how your friends on the board never seemed to get cited for the same issues. A few heads in the audience turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Karen's lips tightened. "If you're suggesting favoritism—" "I'm not suggesting it," Laura said, sliding forward another sheet. "I'm proving it. These are copies of emails you sent to board members approving unregistered structures and landscaping exceptions. But when I applied for the same allowances, you denied me. Why?" "Because I stood up to you." For a moment Karen said nothing. The silence in the room was electric. Then she leaned back, her tone icy. "Mrs. Bennett, these documents appear to be obtained without authorization. That could be a violation of privacy." Laura met her gaze, unflinching. "You know what else is a violation? Forging inspection notices." That landed like a gunshot. Gasps echoed around the room. Mark's hand froze mid-page turn. Carol's fingers stopped typing. Karen's face drained of color. Laura reached into her binder again and pulled out photographs, high-resolution images showing Mark's SUV parked outside her home on nights when anonymous reports had been filed. "You claimed multiple neighbor complaints," Laura said, "but I traced the timestamps. They line up perfectly with surveillance footage from my security camera. It wasn't neighbors filing those reports. It was you," Karen's composure finally cracked. "You can't prove—" "Oh, but I can." Laura opened her laptop and turned it toward the board. On the screen played footage from her front yard camera. Mark crouched by her fence, clipboard in hand, flashlight glinting in the dark. The timestamp glowed in the corner. "This was 2:14 a.m., 3 days before I received a citation for unauthorized landscaping. Care to explain?" The audience erupted in whispers. Mark stammered, That's part of a night inspection program." "Funny," Laura interrupted, "because according to HOA policy, no such program exists." Karen slammed her hand on the table. "Enough. You're out of order, Mrs. Bennett. This meeting is about your violations, not baseless accusations." Laura stood slowly, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "You're right. It is about violations. Yours." She turned to the crowd, hit her neighbors who had once looked away, now watching with wide, uneasy eyes. "For months they've lied to you. They've taken your dues, used them for personal expenses, and punished anyone who dared to question it. You think I'm the only one? Look at these." She held up a folder thick with printed messages. "Emails from other homeowners, people you fined for improper decor, for unapproved paint shades, while board members hosted private barbecues with HOA funds." Karen rose from her chair, voice trembling with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about," Laura said. "And so does the county auditor." Gasps rippled through the room as Laura pulled out the final piece. An official letterhead bearing the seal of the County Civil Oversight Office. "I filed a formal complaint 3 weeks ago. They've been reviewing your financial records. Turns out over $15,000 are unaccounted for." Karen's face turned pale. Mark muttered something under his breath, eyes darting to the papers. Carol looked like she wanted to vanish into her chair. Then Laura delivered the final blow. "And as of this morning, they've opened a formal investigation. Every fine, every assessment fee, every dollar you claim to collect will now be subject to audit." The room erupted. Some people clapped, others shouted questions, but through it all Laura stood motionless. The storm she had weathered for months was now turning on the very people who created it. Karen tried to regain control, slamming her gavel against the table. "Order! Order!" But no one was listening anymore. The illusion of authority was crumbling before her eyes. When the meeting finally descended into chaos, board members arguing, residents demanding answers, Laura gathered her things. She didn't need to stay and watch it burn. She had done what she came to do. But as she reached the door, Karen called after her, voice shaking. "You think this makes you a hero? You've divided this community." Laura turned, her eyes steady. "No," she said quietly. "You did that the moment you made everyone afraid to live here." She walked out into the afternoon sun, the cool air hitting her face like freedom. For the first time in months, she could breathe, but the fallout came fast. Within days, the investigation spread. Residents demanded emergency meetings questioning the legitimacy of years of fines. The HOA's attorney resigned. News of the scandal reached the local paper, and soon headlines appeared online. Homeowners accuse HOA of corruption and intimidation. Reporters showed up at the community entrance, snapping photos of the board members as they tried to dodge questions. Karen tried to control the narrative, sending out a mass email calling Laura a disgruntled resident with a personal vendetta. But it was too late. The evidence Laura had shared was public now. Screenshots, documents, video clips, all circulating through neighborhood group chats and social media. The HOA president's empire was collapsing brick by brick. Mark resigned first, claiming personal reasons. Carol followed, citing stress. That left Karen alone, the queen of a crumbling kingdom. She fought tooth and nail, holding last-minute meetings, sending threatening notices, even trying to discredit the investigation. But the county's findings were damning. Missing funds, forged documents, and unauthorized actions were all traced back to her. The day the official letter arrived, confirming her removal and pending legal action, Laura watched from her window as Karen drove out of the neighborhood for the last time. The same SUV that once stopped in front of her house now disappeared down the road, taillights fading into the distance. But even as the victory settled in, it wasn't triumph Laura felt. It was relief. A deep, aching release after months of being cornered. She walked through her garden, running her hands over the new blossoms that had grown where the old ones were destroyed. The silence felt different now. Not heavy, but peaceful. The neighbors who once avoided her began stopping by. They apologized awkwardly at first. "We didn't know," they said. "We were scared, too." And Laura, though part of her still burned from the betrayal, found herself forgiving them, not because they deserved it, but because she needed to be free. A few weeks later, the HOA was officially dissolved. A new committee formed, smaller, transparent, run by residents who actually cared about the community. They invited Laura to join. She declined. She had fought her war, and she was done with politics. She just wanted her home back, her peace, her soil, her life. One evening, as the sun set behind the maple trees, Laura stood at her fence, the same fence that had started it all. She smiled faintly, remembering every insult, every letter, every sleepless night. And then she whispered to herself, "They buried me in rules, but they forgot I was still growing." The wind carried her words away, soft and sure. As the neighborhood lights flickered on, finally quietly, free of the shadows that once ruled them, when the dust settled. It wasn't the silence of peace that filled the neighborhood. It was the silence of reckoning. For the first time in months, the morning air carried no echo of construction, no rumbling of HOA trucks idling outside driveways, no sharp knocks on doors delivering fines disguised as notices. The street that once seemed like a battlefield now stood still, uneasy in its quiet, as if the entire community was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. And what came was not vengeance. It was truth. The story of what happened had already spread far beyond the cul-de-sac. The video evidence of the HOA's corruption, the falsified fines, the illegal property trespasses, all of it had found its way to local media, then regional, then national. What began as a small-town power struggle had become a symbol of something bigger, the everyday tyranny of people who mistake authority for ownership. And now those people were falling. The first to go was Carol. Her polished smile, once the face of the HOA's order, cracked in the courtroom when the judge read the ruling. The HOA had not only violated multiple property laws, but had also engaged in targeted harassment. The fines they imposed, the threats they sent, the false accusations, they all came crashing down as the evidence played out like a confession reel. Her resignation came within the hour, though the damage to her reputation was irreversible. She tried to hold her head high, leaving the courthouse, but the flash of cameras followed her like ghosts of every life she'd tried to control. Then came the rest. The treasurer, once smug with his clipboards and citations, was found guilty of falsifying financial reports, embezzling HOA funds for personal expenses. The so-called maintenance officer, who had once patrolled lawns with a tape measure, now found himself measuring community service hours instead. And the remaining board members scattered like dry leaves in a storm, each trying to save face, but all drowning in the same tide of exposure. Neighbors who had once stayed silent began to speak. Those who had whispered behind closed blinds now stood openly in their driveways, their voices louder than ever. They spoke not just of the HOA's corruption, but of their own fear, of how easily they had been manipulated into compliance. "We thought we were keeping the neighborhood beautiful," one elderly neighbor confessed, "but all we were doing was keeping each other scared." The protagonist, the homeowner who had endured it all, watched the unraveling not with glee but with quiet disbelief. Revenge had never been the goal. All they had wanted was to live peacefully on their own land, to plant what they wanted, to breathe without fear of fines or surveillance. Yet now, standing on that very land, with the fence still half sunken in concrete, a permanent reminder of resistance, they realized something profound. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers, slow and steady, until it becomes impossible to ignore. The lawsuit's conclusion brought more than vindication, it brought reform. The HOA was dismantled. The community voted unanimously to dissolve it and replace it with an independent neighborhood committee, voluntary, transparent, and accountable. The bylaws that once read like threats were rewritten with words that sounded more like promises. The homeowners took back what had always been theirs, the right to decide what home meant to them. As for the protagonist, they didn't rebuild the fence. Not entirely. They left part of it as it was, concrete buried deep around what used to be the gate. It became a symbol for everyone who walked by, a monument to what happens when control meets defiance. Children who played nearby would sometimes ask, "Why is that part buried like that?" And the parents would smile a little knowingly and say, "Because some things are meant to stay that way. So we remember." In the months that followed, peace didn't come overnight. There were still whispers, still fragments of bitterness clinging to the air. But the difference was clear. The fear had gone. People started waving to each other again. Yards once hidden behind strict hedges opened up. The street, once divided by rules, was now united by choice. There was laughter again, faint but growing. And for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt like what it was meant to be, a place to live, not a place to fight. When the homeowners stood on their porch one quiet evening, the sunset bleeding gold over the roofs, they thought back to how it all began. The day they noticed the fence being built on their land, the helplessness, the anger, the endless meetings, threats, and betrayals. And yet, through it all, they had found something unexpected, resilience, a kind of strength that only reveals itself when you are cornered, tested, and forced to stand alone. They smiled, not because they had won, but because they had endured. And in that endurance, they had changed something far greater than just a neighborhood. They had proven that even in the smallest wars over fences, lawns, and bylaws, there lies a universal truth. The line between right and wrong isn't drawn on a map. It's drawn in the heart of whoever dares to stand up and say, Enough. The story didn't end with court victories or headlines. It ended quietly, in the steady rhythm of life returning to normal, the kind of normal that feels earned, the kind that carries the weight of what it took to get there. And as the night fell over the peaceful street, with porch lights flickering like small stars of defiance, a single question lingered, one that echoed far beyond the boundaries of that little community. When power becomes petty and control turns cruel, how far would you go to take your home back?